excited to be hosting this session for you, to be the moderator here for these fantastic presentations today. My name's Jenny Dale. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an associate professor in the University Libraries here at UNCG. And I am delighted to introduce our first presenter today, Caroline. Caroline Kuhn is a freshman in the Appalachian State University Honors College. She's double majoring in Spanish and English with a concentration in professional writing and a minor in political science. Got a full plate there, Caroline. That's a lot. That's a lot going on. So today we will be hearing from Caroline about patriarchal ideology and Creole culture in Kate Chopin's The Awakening. So Caroline, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, one second. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Caroline Kuhn, and I'm a first-year student in the Honors College at Appalachian State University. In this research paper, I aim to answer the question of, to what extent does the Creole setting impact the patriarchal ideology of Kate Chopin's The Awakening? I utilize several different sources such as literary reviews, literature journal articles, and the novel itself to support my argument that the conservative Creole setting impacts the patriarchal ideology to a great extent and aids in the oppression of the main character, Edna. Just a warning, this presentation does include spoilers about the end of the novel. And for reference, the word Creole refers to descendants of French and Spanish colonists, specifically in New Orleans. Chopin uses aspects of the Creole culture in New Orleans like Catholicism, familial importance, and stereotypic constructs of Creole women to demonstrate feminine struggle in a masculine-dominated society. The Awakening was written in 1897 and published in 1898 and tells the story of Edna Pontellier reckoning with her identity as a woman in a patriarchal society. Edna, originally a Presbyterian from Kentucky, married Léonce Pontellier, a Catholic Creole businessman, and moved to live with him in Louisiana. Her social circle consists of two drastically different female characters, Mademoiselle Reese, an independent single woman who follows her passion for piano and serves as an inspiration for Edna's social awakening, and Madame Adèle Ratignolle, a married woman who represents the ideal feminine trope of the time, dedicated to piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. Along with those supporting female characters, Edna's love, Robert, is a younger man known for flirting with married women. Edna attempts to pursue a relationship with Robert, but realizes he would be just as controlling as her husband, Léonce. Edna's sexual awakening comes with her affair with Alcée Arobin, with whom she also realizes the power she has to escape being controlled by a man. The awakening takes place in late 19th century Louisiana on the Grand Isle, a common vacationing spot for wealthy Creole businessmen and their families, as well as New Orleans. The Creole characters that surround Edna and the unique time period allow her to experience an empowering awakening. The novel concludes when Edna realizes this specific time and place allows no room for a woman who tries to succeed completely independently, and ultimately she drowns herself in the ocean in an act of suicide. The first portion of my argument deals with the religious, specifically Catholic themes in the novel. Catholicism is a very male-centric denomination of Christianity, which has comparatively more strict beliefs than other Christian faiths. The literate discussion surrounding the awakening focuses on the paradox of the Virgin Mother. Since the Creole culture valued Catholicism so highly, the Creole woman was expected to emulate Jesus' Virgin Mother, Mary, and display the ideals of a true woman: piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity, while also replacing her husband's mother. She must simultaneously act as a wife and please her husband in that way. Religion presented an easy division amongst man and wife because going to church and living piously kept the wife separate from negative societal influences. I also examined several Bible quotes, most importantly Ephesians 5:22, which states that wives should be subordinate to their husbands as to the Lord. Although some contemporary Catholics are not as conservative as in the 19th century, the Catholic faith dictates that the Bible is the word of the Lord and is therefore indisputable. This belief further locks Edna into the ideology that she is inferior as a woman. The second part of my argument is based on the Creole value of a wholesome family unit, dominant husband, subservient wife, and a few obedient children. The patriarchal school of thought tells that reproduction is the only purpose of sex. Therefore, once the wife has reproduced, she's expected to return to that virgin mother paradox and abstain from any sexual acts. It's in this restriction that Edna finds more power. She experiences a sexual awakening with her lover, Alcea Eraban, when she realizes that pleasure can also be a purpose of sex. The family unit also dictates that man and wife must be completely separate in their spheres of influence. Chopin tells this through Léonce Montpellier by stating he himself had his hands full with the brokerage business. He could not be in two places at once, making a living for his family on the street and staying home to see that no harm befell them. The husband's productivity is measured in the economic sphere and the wife's in the domestic sphere. However, in wealthy Creole culture, once the children are born, they become the responsibility of a nanny, rendering the wife useless and aimless. This is why Edna turns to other passions and learns how to swim. Ultimately, swimming is seen as a symbol of her breaking free from the patriarchy. However, as you'll see later, this is a controversial and disputed position. The concept of children in the novel is less prevalent than one might expect for a story from this time period. However, the absence of the children is more telling than their presence. Although her two sons have names, Edna rarely calls them by those names, revealing that they are more of a symbol of her oppression rather than actual characters in the novel. Before Edna walks into the ocean at the end, she reflects, the children appeared before her like antagonists who had overcome her, who had overpowered and sought to drag her into the soul's slavery for the rest of her days. She sees her children as an evil in her world who try to stop her progression and discovery. In this instance, her suicide can be seen as a positive because she is rejecting the ideology that she should love and care for her children like a true woman. The third part of my argument is that the women in the society oppress themselves by accepting and following the society's expectations of them. The male characters viewed the female characters through a materialist lens as objects to be won. Therefore, the women take on this materialistic ideology to reckon with the idea that they are only objects in the eyes of men. As I said earlier, the novel ends with Edna drowning herself in the ocean. Why does she do this? This debate is one of the most contested points in literary analysis of the awakening. Majority of the literature points to her suicide as a defeat or a failure. In this argument, the sea is interpreted as a male entity that ultimately consumes Edna. This is more supported by the actual novel, as there are several references to the seductive and overpowering nature of the sea, as well as images of serpent-like waves. I found an interesting take on this from an article titled "The Masculine Sea and the Impossibility of Awakening," which claims that women cannot and do not exist in the first place because they are simply a sociocultural construct based on a male desire to have control over those subordinate to them. On the other hand, if you consider the sea to be a feminine entity, then Edna's suicide is ultimately a success. She has overcome all of her obligations and values herself over the expectations of her as a mother and woman. Her act of suicide is the first decision she makes completely independently. She learns to swim and experiences the freedom of being surrounded by no one. Granted, the only way she did learn to swim was from a man, Robert. Why she chooses death over life in the end is a constant debate among scholars. Regardless of the position one holds, it's undeniable that the patriarchal ideology influenced by Creole society was ultimately the undoing of Edna Pontellier. Kate Chopin wrote The Awakening during the first wave of feminism, and it has constantly and consistently been referenced as a blueprint for other feminist works due to its influence and timeless themes of male oppression over women. I've included some references to the sources that I used. Thank you for listening and paying attention to my presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Caroline. Let's give Caroline a round of applause as well as we can in our Zoom world. So we are going to hold questions until the end, until all of our speakers have had the opportunity to share their excellent papers, but just congratulations, Caroline. It was excellent job, as folks are saying in the chat as well, getting some love there. If you do have questions that come up during either about Caroline's paper or during our other papers that we'll be hearing, please do feel free to put them in the chat and I'll just hold them for us until we get to that Q&A period. So if you're like me and you think of a question and you're afraid you're going to forget, which again happens, especially as you get a little older, it's harder to remember stuff. Feel free to throw that in the chat and I will keep an eye on that. All right, well, we've got one down, but we've got two more. Fabulous papers to come. So our next presenter is Pam Richards, a senior at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and a member of the Disciplinary Honors in Lloyd International Honors College in English. Pam was a recipient of the Agnes and Foster Osborne Memorial Scholarship and was recognized on the Lloyd International Honors College Dean's List. Just before returning to college at UNCG in 2020, she retired from a 25-year career in sales, customer service, and public relations. 2020, what a tough time to come back to college. But that's great. All right, Pam, we're so excited to see your presentation, and I will turn it over to you.
We go. Sorry about that. I lost the button. There we go. I'm sorry. Hi, my name is Pam Richards. Thank you, Professor Dale. I really appreciate this opportunity. My paper is Faults, Frailty, and Faith in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. These are the sources I cited in the paper, and I will show those again at the end. This poem, written anonymously in the 14th century, has over 2,500 lines. The author, Britannica calls the poem technically brilliant, and I think you would agree it is also a very compelling story. My paper examines whether the Christianity expressed in the poem by Sir Gawain and other characters represents a true faith or one in words only. I believe the poem illustrates redemption that is central to Christian belief. The initial setting is a Christian celebration at the court of King Arthur, with Queen Guinevere and the knights present as well. The Green Knight bursts in on his green horse with a huge axe and offers a bizarre proposal. Sir Gawain sees himself as the least among the knights. He believes this makes him the best candidate to risk death, so he accepts the Green Knight's challenge on behalf of King Arthur. Gawain's sacrificial offer corresponds to Christ's willingness to die in our place. Sir Gawain decapitates the Green Knight in accordance with the terms. The Green Knight retrieves his head, gets back up on his horse, and he vows to return an axe blow to Sir Gawain at the Green Chapel in 1 year. The year passes, and King Arthur prays a blessing for Sir Gawain as he prepares to leave. This prayer is an indication of Arthur's faith in Christ and is an example of spiritual leadership. The friends, fearful for Gawain's fate, commend him to Christ. With his shield and pentangle, Gawain embarks on his journey. The poem contains Christian practices that mirror those of the Orthodox Christian Church today. Johnson describes the significance of following the liturgical calendar as a way to align oneself with eternal truths. The beginning of the poem mentions the feast with meat and mirth. This may suggest that the nativity fast from meat has been completed. The chanting in chapel most likely refers to the chanted reading of the Psalms. Gawain overcomes numerous obstacles as he travels. In the midst of the freezing cold, he prays for a place to attend nativity services. Gawain's prayer is answered and haute dessert comes into view. The games of hunting, seduction, and exchanges ensue. Gawain is treated as an honored guest at haute dessert. The residents give thanks to God for Gawain's visit, and Gawain and Baron Bertilac enjoy fellowship and a church service together. Christians are called to emulate the perfection of Christ, but it should be no surprise that we often fail, and Gawain is no exception. Sattergood asserts that Gawain is tempted at haute dessert through the sins of the flesh, including sloth, too much wine, and idleness. When Gawain is literally trapped by Lady Bertilac, how is he to adhere to his knightly ideal of courtesy and refrain from sin at the same time? Gawain is able to avoid serious sin by divine invocation, but he accepts the green girdle for protection from the Green Knight's axe. Horgan maintains that Gawain is able to fully trust God in battle, but fails to trust God by accepting the girdle. Gawain gives 3 kisses that he receives while Bertilac is away in exchange for meat and fox pelt from Bertilac. However, Gawain does not reveal or relinquish the girdle gift in accordance with their agreement. However, gift giving is a reminder of God's gift of his Son for our salvation in exchange for repentance. This can be seen in accordance with Greenblatt's theory of symbolic acquisition and clearly represents an unequal exchange. Gawain finds that the Green Chapel is a cave. In Orthodox tradition, Jesus is born in a cave. I see the Green Knight as the rood of Christ. The cave and the tree represent the beginning and the ending of the earthly life of Jesus and the spiritual rebirth for Gawain. The cross was an instrument of death that was transformed by the resurrection into the life-giving cross. The Green Knight also represents an instrument of death. He has 2 opportunities to kill Gawain, yet Gawain lives. The Green Knight redeems Gawain by showing mercy. Gawain experiences spiritual rebirth by his confession. The Green Knight reveals his identity and all is explained. Gawain returns to Camelot and is received as a hero, but he keeps the girdle in humility as a remembrance. In conclusion, the identity of the Green Knight we learn is revealed as Baron Bertilac. And we learned that Morgan Le Fay developed the incredible plan to test the virtues of King Arthur's court. While we may question the implementation of magical arts by the Bertilacs, who are professing Christians, Greenblatt sees a relationship of hidden unity between the total artist and cosmic or creative powers. Foucault maintains power should be thought of in the positive ways of creating opportunity. Le Fay's powers are used in the special effects, and the social powers of the Bertilacs are used in arranging the testing of Gawain. The conflict between the Christian church and sorcery is shown by Morgan exerting her power to terrify Queen Guinevere. Gawain learns the futility of placing his faith in anything other than God, who is the greater cosmic power in the poem. Although Gawain is forced to face his own frailty, fortunately, he is able to retain his head. These are the these are the sources that I cited, and I also referred to the Dream of the Rood in the slide presentation, and it's another wonderful poem if you haven't read it, but it's a lot shorter than Sir Gawain. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Pam. Let's give Pam a round of applause. That was fantastic. All right. Yeah, some wonderful comments in the chat here. All right, and so again, we will hold any questions until all of the folks have presented, but if you do have them and want to put them in the chat, that's completely okay. Well, I will go ahead and introduce our final presenter today. Pull up my bio document. So we've got Cameron Calvin Farrar, a senior sociology and political science double major with a minor in rhetoric and public advocacy at UNC Greensboro. Cameron is currently a student in the Lloyd International Honors College, and at his time at UNC Greensboro has been the recipient of the Spartan of Promise Award, a student peer educator for the Office of Intercultural Engagement, and a Democracy Fellow for the Office of Leadership and Civic Engagement. So please join me in welcoming Cameron, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I will go ahead and share my screen. All right. So today we are going to be talking about the manufacturing of dehumanization, particularly through the lens of what we categorize as genocide and what we categorize as worthy of recognition. And this is particularly through the lens of Black America. And yeah, I'm happy to be talking about this today. So I want to first open with this quote. Recharge Genocide is a 1951 publication, essentially that is an address to the United Nations and a demand for recognition of the treatment of Black America as genocidal. And this particular quote is from the introduction. It says, "The genocide of which we complain is much of a fact as is gravity. In one form or another, it has been practiced for more than 300 years, although never with such sinister implications for the welfare and peace of the world as to present. Its very familiarity disguises its horror." And that last line particularly is what we're going to be talking about. The reproduction of horror, so much so that it becomes desensitized to us and that we don't recognize it as such, and that it becomes too big of an ask to recognize this inhumane treatment as genocide as we would likely any other group. So I want to first start by defining these terms that I use very often in this paper, but also that I will use in this discussion. And so humanization is to represent something as human. And it's a transitioning verb. So it's often the process of becoming human and putting human traits onto something. And dehumanization, again, a transitional verb to deprive someone of human qualities, personality, or dignity. And that's why I titled this paper, The Manufacturing of Dehumanization, because as a society, we lack a certain humanity for Black Americans. And so what is genocide, right? This is a term that by definition varies. And so the terminology that I wanted to focus on, because this was a publication to the United Nations is their definition of genocide as per their conventions that they hold. And genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a nation, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And below are the listings of things that qualify per the United Nations as genocide. And in my paper, I make it a point to focus on these, but I don't say that that's what I'm doing, because I believe that there's a certain point where I would like the reader to say, this does qualify as genocide, without me saying, well, this is actually the meaning of every single point that we would typically regard something as such. And I feel like that's the individual reader's job to come up to that conclusion themselves with the overwhelming evidence that I present. And so we will be talking today about these particular points. So the killing of Black people, right? That's the first point, is the killing of individuals. And from 1882 to 1968, which was 2 years before my father was born, for context of how recent this is, almost 5,000 people were lynched. And lynching doesn't always have to look like noose and strangulation. It can oftentimes be removing people from prison cells, people going missing and being publicly and inhumanely murdered. And this is, what we see in transition from the final years of enslavement into a Reconstruction, and on the beginning cusp of this sort of overlap between Reconstruction and Jim Crow. But I also want to give light to modern day occurrences, which is the death penalty verdict. We see that the 13th Amendment allows for the treatment of individuals who are incarcerated as sort of an exemption of humanity, an exemption of human status. And we see for some time, a small amount of time, the death penalty was actually done away with, because it was shown that overwhelmingly we were sentencing Black people and people of color to death. And this is just one point of that, which is in cases where Black defendants had assaulted white victims, 299 of them were put on the death penalty. As in the, on the opposite side of that, you have 21 white defendants who committed crimes against Black people being put on the death penalty. So these numbers are nowhere fundamentally close in nature. But then you also have another apparatus of the legal system committing murder for whichever case you can, of course, I would leave that to you, but ultimately, since 2017, over 1,000 people have been shot and murdered by police. And this is an apparatus of legal murder. Whether you recognize the legitimacy of these institutions, that is up for your own interpretation, but ultimately these are still Black people being killed in different ways. So now we can also move on to causing serious bodily or mental harm to Black people. And this is another proponent of what is categorized as genocide. And so a lot of times, studies show that Black college students, Black traditional college age students will cite mental health deterioration from the racialized aggression that they're experiencing, from the microaggressions, the macroaggressions, the more slanted and slight sorts of racism, but also more violent and in-your-face acts of verbal attacks. You also have food apartheid, which is the lack of access to food resources, the lack of access to grocery stores in your area. Is considered a food desert if you don't have a grocery store within a mile radius of you. And a lot of times we see these food deserts overlapping in communities of color, particularly Black communities. You also have the fact that African Americans are at higher risk of being exposed to particulate matter and pollution. And essentially what particulate matter does when inhaled, it can cause respiratory issues of course, because you're inhaling pollutants, but it also is fine particulate matter, which is worse for your lungs. And it's one of the worst sorts of pollutions that you could be exposed to. And then you also have the fact that 75%, or that Black people are 75% more likely to live in close quarters with plants that are producing hazardous waste. So these are overwhelmingly in every city in America the case, that you're finding food deserts, you're finding people that are being put in close proximity to dangerous chemicals, and essentially no autonomy to demand this. And actually, one of these pictures, what you see is actually Warren County. This is where we see the rise of environmental justice, and we start to see the term used like of environmental racism in the 70s. And the individuals in Warren County, you know, they weren't taken seriously, and they didn't ultimately get the recognition that they deserved, but they were the start of essentially what we start to see as the recognition of environmental racism. And I also wanted to, provide this quote because I think Du Bois makes a very interesting point about what we're doing when we put Black people in these situations, but I also want to make a segue into Black laborers. So the free Negro was systematically discouraged, disenfranchised, and reduced to serfdom. He became by law the easiest victim of the kidnapper and liable to treatment as a fugitive slave. And what this means is when you make a particular group overwhelmingly vulnerable to a lot of different forms of adverse treatments that are meant to silence them, that are meant to hurt them, that are meant to kill and provide no sort of educational resources or access to financial resources, you're putting people in dangerous situations where they're having to look for alternatives to survive. And that is the case of the Black laborer, deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So this looks like wage theft. This looks like income inequality. Right? The fact that Black women and Black men do not, first of all, make the same based on gender, but also that that racial category shifts the amount of income that they have typically from the perspective of the white male dollar. Generational perceptions of Black labor contributions, right? We are seeing that we've transitioned from enslavement to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to wage theft. And I think recently there was something of like of $3 billion reallocated back to workers because they were experiencing wage theft in like 2020. And the Black labor experiences, of course, is gendered. Like I recently stated, that they're not the same, but they're both different forms of inequality. And when you don't have access to lucrative financial resources, you don't have access to good healthcare. You don't have access to purchasing homes. You don't have access to all of these things that put you in an economically insecure situation, but also shape your life because of these sorts of inequalities that you're facing. And the impact of dehumanization, I'll close with this. I want to try to be cognizant of the time I have. And this is actually a line from my essay, is that this would not be a bold statement if it were not for 400 years of deafening American ears to Black suffering. To claim that this is genocide is something that if it were any other group, and including, I also want to recognize the genocide of Indigenous people. These are not these broad gestures and these big, stakes and takes. These are facts per the definitions that we prescribe to these issues. They're just not being recognized as such because of the lack of humanization and care and regard for these groups of particularly vulnerable people. And with that, I'll say thank you so much for listening. I appreciate sharing space with you, and I appreciate you having me. And I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Cameron. Let's give Cameron a round of applause. And let's just give one more round of applause to all of our presenters. Fantastic. I'm so excited that I've had the opportunity to moderate this session. So we have plenty of time for questions. I haven't seen any questions come in through the chat, but if you do have a question, you can feel free to put that in the chat. You can also feel free to use the Zoom raise your hand icon, and I can call on you if you'd like to unmute and ask your question. Lots of options. Okay, yes, Heather, go
Hey.
ahead.
Hi, friend Carolyn. That was wonderful. All the presentations were wonderful. Thank you all. Carolyn, I am Carolyn's academic mentor in the Honors College at Appalachian. And Carolyn, I of course am an art historian, and so I'm always interested in images. And I was super curious that you were using images, but from what I think is a film version of your novel to sort of illustrate your presentation. And I wondered if you might speak to sort of your choices around that, because it's not something we always see in literature, literary studies presentations, but I think it added wonderfully to your visual part of your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Waldrop. Originally, I was going to include watercolor paintings because I found this collection of several watercolor paintings based on events in the awakening. And then I realized it would be sort of like, it helped me kind of connect the characters to actual visual faces because I had this perception of them. And then I thought it would be interesting to see what the actual film adaptation was. And also I've taken a couple arts-based research classes, and those are really helping me sort of make the connection between art and literature in my studies.
Wonderful, thank you.
I want to draw on that a little bit. I noticed that all of you use really powerful visual communication in your presentations. And I'm wondering if either Pam or Cameron or both of you would want to speak about how you chose those images.
Well, I was mostly going for aesthetically pleasing, but also something that would represent the time, the medieval times. And so I was very fortunate to find some excellent images, I thought, that were, of course, the first one was the book. And, but I was pleased with the way those came out.
Yeah, a lot of interesting because you were able to draw on a lot of the religious imagery as well. That was cool. How about you, Cameron?
For me particularly, I wanted my visuals to be as pertinent and directly correlated to what was on the screen, just because I know it was a lot and very dense sort of content. And so I wanted to not take away from that and to make sure it was easy to kind of stay involved and to stay focused without being too overwhelmed.
I do have a question for Cameron.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Cameron, one of your slides mentioned something about preventing births. Did you want to elaborate on that a little bit for us, if that's okay?
Yes. So part of, actually, thank you for that question, Pam, I appreciate it. Part of what the UN describes as genocide is the prevention of births. And I didn't talk about this in my presentation, but through the South particularly, and a lot in California, individuals particularly who were Black and poor and people of color were victims of forced sterilization in large amounts of numbers. And this continued up until the 70s. North Carolina didn't close doors on their clinic. I keep a photo on my wall to remind me of the significance of what it looks like to dwindle a population down. But North Carolina did have a very robust, unfortunately, a clinic. And you could be sterilized because you were poor. You could be sterilized because you were medically unfit. A really popular way of doing this was to not inform people at all. And so you have, I don't know if you've ever heard of Fannie Lou Hamer, but she coins the term a Mississippi appendectomy, which is when individuals would go to get a routine surgery and would leave unknowingly sterilized. And this was a common practice in the South, and it was done deliberately to thin out the Black population. And this was something that only a few people ever received compensation for after the fact, in the modern day, only recently. But there are thousands of individuals, Black, Indigenous, Brown, who lived through that silent suffering and never received any sort of compensation or recognition for it.
Thank you.
All right, Gabriella, you had your hand up.
Yes, I have a question for Caroline. So you mentioned that Edna's suicide was a debate and whether it could be considered a success and defeat. And I have personally never read this book, but I would like to know your opinion on that.
Thank you for the question. In my personal opinion, obviously based on the research that I've done, I think Edna's suicide is a defeat in the end, ultimately, mainly because of this symbolism, this imagery that occurs in the novel several times. It's an image of a bird in a cage, which symbolizes the entrapment of the female characters. And then as Edna's walking on the beach, deciding whether or not to commit suicide, she sees this bird with a broken wing who sort of like crashes into the ocean. And so I saw that as a symbol of the bird symbolizing the females succumbing to the patriarchy. And it's like the bird flying away is Edna's attempt to escape, yet her obligations as a woman ultimately break her wings and just eliminate any further attempts of escaping the patriarchy.
Thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions?
I just wanted to say these were 3 wonderful presentations, and it was really interesting the kind of ways in which they connected in some interesting and unexpected ways. So thank you all for these.
Yeah, I've been moderating sessions or chairing sessions at the Honor Symposium for a while now. And I think every year that happens where I think, well, these are so different. And then I'm like, well, there's a lot of like stuff that comes in and brings these together. So yes, really, really great. I'm so delighted to have been able to read y'all's papers and see your presentations. We do still have time for questions if anybody has any, but I won't call on people. I know that's not very fun. Thanks so much for coming, Heather. All right, well, I am not hearing any other questions coming up. I believe the next round of several different presentations is at 3. So I would certainly encourage you to go see more amazing presentations if you can. And I just want to thank our presenters so much for your hard work, for all your intellectual effort, your emotional labor, all of that stuff that goes into this kind of rigorous academic work. And to say, these were great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Eric, for handling the setup and everything.
Yes, thank you all. Those were amazing presentations.
Thank you. I credit Dr. Lim. When I got the assignment, I was not sure how on earth I was going to pull it off.
Well, you did. You definitely did.
But it was, I really enjoyed this. Thank you for the opportunity. And thank you, Cameron and Caroline, as well, for really great presentations. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and a good weekend.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.